Niels.
Tilman.
Who do we have?
Oh, it's Julie.
Julie Williamson. Hi.
Yeah, good morning. It's great to be hanging out with you guys today.
Cool. So Julie is from Glasgow University, right? And you became interested in virtual reality lately.
Yes. So yeah, I'm an academic at University of Glasgow, and I have been there since 2008 in various roles. But yeah, so I have been interested my whole kind of life, research life, in unusual displays and non-planar displays. And so it's kind of a natural progression to go to head-mounted displays. And I do love virtual reality, but one of the things that I think is really interesting in thinking about virtual reality, certainly moving forward, is this more of like a continuous spectrum, right, between like AR, MR, VR. And that's one of the spaces that I'm kind of trying to work in right now, is making that feel continuous rather than these kind of like discrete zones. And the hardware is like definitely not there yet, but kind of thinking about moving towards that is pretty fun. And so, yeah, I mean, I do a lot of work with Oculus Quest. Is one of my kind of exciting devices right now because it is mobile and you can take it out into the real world, but also, you know, interested in all sorts of these types of devices. HTC Vive, of course, is what a lot of people use, or like the Valve Index is what we've been using lately. But you know, it's the hardware is the kind of main limitation, but that doesn't stop us from imagining where it's going to go. Hopefully sooner, that it's not some kind of giant, you know, face covering thing, but maybe something more like the form factor of like a Bose Frames or something, which is an audio AR device, which is actually pretty cool. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at this moment.
What's your high score in Dance Saber?
I've only played it a few times. When it comes to VR games, I'm actually a complete VR chat junkie. If you ever want to like wonder, you know, what am I doing in this world and what is the meaning of any of this, go into VR chat and it's just this kind of out of body experience of strangeness. And so yeah, I spend a lot of time in VR chat, especially now in lockdown. It's quite an interesting space. Have you ever played VR chat?
No.
I mean, it's, as it sounds, it's just a kind of immersive chat platform. So you have, you know, rooms and you can move around with different rooms and different types of settings. And obviously other networked people are there. But it's got its own kind of strange norms and standards. And there's some nice rooms. I like to go to a room where you can kind of stand on this rooftop and look out over a sunset. And it's kind of like a party rooftop, so people are often up there, you know, having a few drinks and chilling out. And it's you know, it's a strange place, but I enjoy spending time there.
Cool. Is that one of your favorite VR applications then? What other applications do you use or are you excited about?
Yeah, I mean, there's, for my own part, a lot of the stuff that I've been interested in kind of research-wise and just personally is kind of more entertainment, some amount of gaming, but more the kind of theater and performance type of entertainment. I mean, so there's a couple of really nice games that I like. Superhot is a nice one, and so is Unseen Diplomacy, which does a lot of redirected walking, which is quite interesting. So if you've got a smaller, well, you still need quite a large space, like 4 meters, but you kind of feel like you're walking around a large compound when really you're just doing some redirected walking. So it's a really nice example of like a commercial product that's doing that. But some of the other things that I've been mostly interested in is kind of entertainment and theater and co-located experience. So one of the things that my most favorite project that I did recently was with National Theatre Scotland. And so we had a mix of different types of spaces that had been built out on a kind of soundstage. And it was a mix of kind of intimate performance, so kind of one-on-one. We had live actors and people kind of there. It was designed for groups of 8. And then we had these different kind of rooms that people would move towards and move between. And so it was myself, it was the performer who was kind of leading the project. And then we also had a theater designer. So it's kind of 3 people from very different fields. And it was really interesting working with those people. I'd never worked directly with someone who was like from theater design, and thinking about, she would be talking about, the choreography of moving between different spaces. And, I would be from the technical side talking about, well, how are we going to enter and exit VR? What's that going to feel like? And then the kind of performer then talking about, well, what's the content going to look like? How are we going to actually get people to want to come into the virtual space or the other physical spaces? So it was the most satisfying work actually that I've done. And we've got some nice video and imagery actually from that. We did a kind of series of performances over one day of that. And that was inspired by the work of Berger. I always forget the name of the title. Our Faces, Photographs Still as Memories, something like that. I'll send some nice pictures. But that was really nice. And that's mostly based on, having a bunch of people together in the same physical space. So a little bit different than VR chat. And trying to see, could that be a space where actually people are more willing to don a headset to do something that's a little bit more unusual, because they are in a group, they're kind of being guided through this. They have an actor there who's kind of setting the scene and giving some content. So it's a very different setting. And I like that because I think that's kind of the early adoption scenario. We're not going to have people, sitting at the pub, popping on a headset right now. But you might have someone at a festival attending a performance willing to kind of do that. So that's one of the scenarios where I'm thinking this is somewhere where we could actually incorporate some of the more unusual actions and headsets. People will be willing to actually do it. So yeah, it's early adoption scenarios is where I'm focusing right now, because VR headsets are obviously pretty bulky and pretty unusual still in daily life.
Was that all about the headsets, or did you also incorporate other sensors to track different body parts in that experience?
Yeah, so that one was just about the headsets, and actually we were only using 3 degrees of freedom tracking. So we were using Oculus Go's for that, just so people could pop in and pop out. But one of the things that I liked about that particular project was that we actually, so Oculus Go and actually Oculus Quest as well has open ear audio. So your ears are not like covered by anything. And actually the kind of speakers are based here along the straps. So what we did is we had the kind of soundscapes that were in the headsets, but then we also had loudspeakers in the environment to give some physically spatialized audio. So as you went in different rooms, you would hear different parts of the external soundscape and the one in the headset. And the idea there was we wanted to try to see, could we get people to question, what's in the virtual environment, what's in the physical environment, and to really feel like it was unclear kind of which was coming from where. And there was some live performance happening as well. So there would be voices in the headset, voices in the environment, to try to, blur those boundaries in a little bit more of a different way. So open ear audio is one of the things, and audio transparency is kind of another way that it's described as something that I think is really exciting, especially once we can go back into social settings and kind of public settings. The audio transparency is really interesting.
What you described that are very explorative applications, it seems, right? But if you look at the commercial market at the moment, it's all about gaming. Do you think these more serious applications or very different applications, will they last?
Yeah, so entertainment is definitely one which I think is fun, and there is a kind of big market there, certainly not at the moment, but festivals and performance and kind of cultural events are quite a big market. But one of the things that I've also been interested in is kind of productivity or kind of virtual events. Shock, surprise, in light of lockdown, we've all had to kind of reposition ourselves. And so one of the other projects that I'm super excited about is Mozilla Hubs. So actually I've got a Hubs cloud instance that I use as my kind of testing space via Hero.club, to note that. But yeah, so we're using that to kind of look at running virtual conferences. And because at least my own kind of favored conference experience is the social part of the conference. I mean, I like catching up with people, I like networking, I like socializing ideas. All of these things are for me the most important part. So obviously when I'm thinking about virtual events, this is the part that I'm most keen to try to replicate. So I was part of a participant in a workshop run as part of hci, social VR workshop. And as a participant there and kind of doing the analysis of the data as kind of a person involved after the fact, I mean, I'm looking at things like, how do people form groups in virtual environments? What type of standing distances are they choosing to do? How do people, this is especially interesting, kind of enter a group and exit a group? If we're in physical spaces, there are kind of these ways that people do that by their body orientation, by their standing distance. And the thing that it looks like is in a virtual environment, these same issues are cropping up. And this work, there's a ton of work, kind of in the 90s when kind of virtual environments were first becoming really popular. And all of that work really still stands. But I think the thing that's interesting now is we have so many more social signals that we can start to wrap into that. So where initially the kind of very basic social signals, so, are you present? Are you not? Which way are you facing? That was what some of these early virtual environments had. But now, we would have, if you're in VR, for example, in Hubs, you have a fully articulated hands and you've got your head kind of orientation, and you've got high quality speech and avatars can have all sorts of different affordances. So basically trying to see, if you're in an immersive VE or if you're on desktop, how does this change your standing distance, the way you enter and form groups? And so that's some of the analysis that I'm working on now, and actually looking at trying to incorporate some of these techniques into our custom Hubs instance for upcoming conferences. Mm-hmm. So I'm quite keen to do some nice UI elements. We're implementing accessibility features and also things like adding some better processing and better kind of parameters for the soundscape, so that, what's the equivalent in a virtual environment of me leaning in and saying something to you privately during a talk? Could we use those social signals to actually adjust? Mm-hmm. Since we do have control over this environment, what could we do that's interesting? Yeah. So Mozilla Hubs is really nice in that it's open source, but you can then, it's fully supported to host as a cloud instance. So that's what we're doing, myself and my colleagues, I'm in Shama.
We used Mozilla Hubs 2 weeks ago for the poster session of Kai Down Under, which was kind of like the Australian, New Zealand supplemental event for Kai. And we arranged the posters in a kind of like an oval space. And when you talked about the social signals, it was interesting. So we placed an SV there to kind of help first-timers to navigate the space and how to kind of interact with the posters. And there were also videos in there, which was kind of cool. But one thing I noticed was when you walked around the space, you could actually see the avatars. When they grabbed the poster to go into this reading mode, the avatar would stand there and look up. And so it would really convey that notion of, oh, this person is right now inspecting the poster, and it was really interesting. And then you could kind of like creep up behind them and start talking about different parts of the poster. So I found that really that worked really well in that sense, where that social element was replicated in a virtual space.
Yeah. Did you use that Hubs instance? Were you on desktop, or did you have some people in VR as well?
So I was on desktop. I'm not sure really. I didn't ask the people in there.
Yeah, because that's one of the things that's really interesting. On desktop, it's nice, and I think it's better than a lot of the other kind of platforms that we've got. It's better than just doing a Twitch stream or something. But in VR, it's actually like a total step up. I think it's a completely different experience, which is, it adds so much. I mean, as a VR enthusiast, I joined this workshop in VR, and I was like, I'm that dork who's like rocking up with my headset and stuff, but the experience was so much different. And I think one of the main things about that was the spatialized audio. If you've got your head tracked and spatialized audio, I mean, somebody could sneak up behind you and say something here, and you hear it. You can turn directly towards it, and you don't get that with the desktop version. Certainly not to the same at all, the same kind of experience. And so it's really interesting. The audio is something that I'm really keen to play around with and kind of see what we can do with it. One of my favorite devices, which I've been playing around with a lot, is the Bose frames, which I don't know if you've seen them. They just look like glasses, but they have directional speakers that give you private but transparent audio in your ear. So you can be sitting, you know, in an environment and hearing something that nobody else is hearing, but they have 3 degrees of freedom tracking. So you can get the spatialized audio, you can position audio in 3D space and get really nice sound from that. So that's one of the other devices that I've been playing around with. Again, something that is already in a form factor where you can take it out into the wild, quote unquote, and play around with some immersive audio channel only, but audio is a really interesting space in the immersive world.
So it's a lot about replication. So what you talked about was replicating this and that, replicating audio. Is that it? Can a virtual experience only replicate the physical space? So can it ever get better than what we experience in the physical world?
See, I that's a great question. And I think it can get better because yes, we can replicate the physical world, but we're also not constrained by the physical world. So, you know, in the physical world, you know, for my own voice, for example, it comes out of a specific space and there's a certain amount of dispersion in the environment. But in a virtual world, I could do something totally different. So let's say we're standing in a poster session and it's a busy poster session and I want to whisper something to Tillman, but he's across the room. And I could, for example, somehow, you know, see him in my field of view and say, you know, whisper to Tillman that this poster is really cool. And he might hear that in his own environment and at a distance, you know, so I could actually extend my capabilities quite a lot. Taking affordance, this kind of whisper idea, but not having that physical limitation that he needs to be within a certain distance from me to actually do that. So there's all sorts of different things that we could do in that space. And it's something that my Kai workshop last year, Ken Perlin was one of our speakers. And I really liked how he described it. He describes adding these kind of capabilities as like our new superpowers. And he has all sorts of different ideas around what superpowers having just even an immersive audio channel would add. So I think there's a lot of stuff that can be done there that's not just replicating the kind of physical affordances, but actually extending them in ways that we couldn't do until we had this kind of open ear private audio with 6 degrees of freedom tracking once it's there.
So we were especially interested in how the avatar of the user changes, how you interact, but also, I don't know, how strong you feel, how strong you are if you lift weights or something like that. Is that something that lasts? So what we are wondering about, how long does this effect last? So I give you a stronger body or a different body, and this will probably wear off, we believe. So these things about virtual reality, how much is novelty and how much will persist?
Yeah, I mean, that one I'm not really sure because there are so many different application areas and I think it would vary between different things. So one of my absolute favorite pieces of work around kind of body ownership and body ownership illusions is someone who I work with on the Levitate project, Sophia Seinfeld, who was in Mel Slater's lab before she joined Jörg Müller's. This work that they did is one of my favorite things, and it's so strange and unusual. So they took people who had been convicted of domestic violence, so they were abusers against their partners, and they put them into VR and put them into the body of the person who they had been abusive towards. And then some agent in VR came and, you know, was abusive towards them and basically trying to give them that perspective, you know, put them in the shoes of the other person. But what they had found was that this was hugely effective at kind of reforming people who had previously been, you know, domestic violence, who had been part of domestic violence or abusers. But the video that I saw of this was so telling. So one of the things that they use a lot in that work is mirrors, so that you get that body ownership illusion, you see yourself. And there's this video of you know, this burly dude who had previously been in a domestic abuser, and he's being yelled at and screamed at in VR, which has got to be pretty traumatizing, but it's an interesting study. But he looks, you know, he's being yelled and screamed at about his body and that he's fat and, you know, all this type of stuff. And he looks in the mirror and he kind of does this gesture, like kind of touching his avatar body. And it was such a kind of nice moment, because I think probably somebody who's been on the receiving end of that kind of abuse has done that type of gesture, that type of movement, being uncomfortable in their own body. And to see somebody who had previously been on the other side of that so immediately kind of doing that gesture was really telling. And they had really nice results with this study, kind of reforming people and actually ending that cycle of abuse. So that's a context where I think, you do see something really important changing, because the underlying kind of psychology is what's driving that research. Whether or not I feel more, cool or sexy because I look hot in VR is maybe something a little bit different. But I think with the right kind of theory underneath, I think you really can change the mind, even being in a virtual environment.
They also did interesting work on racism. So Mel Slater's group, I'm sure you know that as well. So this where they put, I think it was female students into dark-skinned bodies, and then they showed, okay, it reduces their implicit biases. But what I found interesting, they tested them again after, I think, a week or something, and it was persisting. So that's something I found interesting. So it's not just this very short-term effect where you directly measure after the intervention, but it even persisted for a longer period of time. And maybe that's interesting about VR, because they only did this intervention for a very short time, but even though it lasted for much longer. And if you think about using VR more often or more regularly, and then doing things as you described, that might be very interesting, might even improve our society, I would guess.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting, I think, unknown impacts still from what using VR is going to do. I mean, one of my favorite things about this is it's discussed in the Stephen Laval book, that if you explore an environment in VR and create kind of a mental map of the layout of the rooms and this kind of thing, it actually activates the same part of the brain as if you had physically walked around some place, right? So we know that it's certainly, your mind is not necessarily distinguishing between these real memories and fake memories or virtual memories, whatever you want to call it. And this year at CHI, we held a workshop on the ethics of VR and kind of dystopian scenarios. Because as much as you could, use VR to make people aware of racism, which is so relevant in this current time, you could also do the opposite. You could make people less sensitive to these issues. You could reduce people's fear of, going out and doing violence, for example, desensitize them to that. So there's all sorts of strange ways that once we have this kind of thing sitting between the real world and our perceptions, we could change our mind in ways that we don't necessarily know or don't really want to do. So it's an interesting minefield, actually, and there's a lot of interesting work in that space right now as well. So who knows, maybe it's the end of the world and I'm part of the beginning of the end, but
But I haven't seen so much discussion about it. So for previous media, I mean, goes back to comic books, I think, or maybe books in general. And then, of course, for movies and TV and gaming and now VR, I haven't seen much public discussion about the negative effects of it. I mean, there's academic discussions about it, but have you seen the public discussing it?
Really not as much as it probably should be. I mean, there's a handful of kind of academic articles that are really nice, talking about the kind of potential negative impacts. Actually, one of my colleagues at Strathclyde University, Graham Wilson, has done some research on how game ratings for violence should actually probably be different for immersive games versus controller-based ones. He did find some really interesting results around how much more kind of frightening it can be. He did some studies, I think, on Silent Hill. So you have kind of like zombies coming in your face with knives and stuff, and you're like physically restraining them, and it's frightening, right? And you're physically enacting these actions. And so he did some nice kind of work in advocacy on how ratings should include a different scale for immersive games. But yeah, there's not as much worry about it as there probably should be.
maybe that will hit us in a few years then.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I've been trying with varying stages of unsuccess, trying to get some funding for to focus on. And the kind of term that I've been using to think about it is this mediated perception. It's something that's very different than any other technology that we've used. You know, if you think about some of the backlash against like mobile devices and digital narcissism, right? That's an interesting moral stance to take, I suppose. But still, that's this kind of window that you're peering into, and it's this kind of thing that exists in the world. But you know, there it is. It's an artifact that's there. But if we're talking about immersive technologies, it's actually something that's not in the world, but it's between like our mind and the world, which is very different. I think it's a qualitatively really different thing, because presumably once VR gets to the point where we can't distinguish virtual content from physical content, then, you know, the way that we build these memories and the way we remember our lives could be incredibly different. So I think it's this kind of step change from technologies that are existing in the world and maybe changing the way we behave, but not changing the way we perceive reality, right? So this barrier between our perception and the physical world is something that we should be much more critical and reflective about, more so than any other type of technology that has like ruined society or made people these digital narcissists. You know, having an immersive device always on, which is kind of what I'm trying to think about, is a real change. And so, yeah, mediating our perception is something we should probably be more worried about.
So there were some people who use these devices for longer periods of time, things like 10 hours, 24 hours. I think people went for 48 hours eating in VR, doing everything in VR.
Was that Frank Steinecke?
Frank Steinecke did it. Yeah. I think there were also some from people from magazines who also did that. And what Frank, I think he says that it kind of wears off, so it didn't get more immersive over time. So that he still felt in VR, but it didn't increase over time. I'm not sure if that's because of the technology level that we have at the moment, or if that is a general thing that you at one point realize, oh, this is really not the real world. But on the other hand, I think it is the real world, right? It's just a different type of looking at the real world.
Yeah, so I mean, so things that are real in your perception are real in your reality. So I mean, even if the environment is of a relatively low fidelity, I think it's still activating the right parts of your brain. And I mean, that's those types of limitations about, you know, the number of polygons that can be rendered or the kind of realism of the scene. I mean, those things are going to be solved. And if we're already having these experiences in low fidelity environments, I think it's exciting to think about when we get to the next stage and these environments look as good or better than real environments. Yeah, I mean, one of the kind of VR taglines that I really like when we think about the ethics of realism in VR is, you know, what do we do when virtual life becomes better than real life, right? Who are you to say I couldn't lead my life in VR because it's better than this reality that we're experiencing, right? I mean, it's a reasonable idea that people might choose to not live in the physical world, especially going how things are going. I mean, yeah. Virtual life might become better sooner rather than later.
And memory trick on us, right? If I think back on my career as a as a video gamer 20 years ago, and back then the games seemed so real, right? It's like Doom or The Settlers and all these games that came out. But when I look at them now, I actually realize how pixelated and badly, you know, the experience itself is. But in my memory, they were really very much real, and I was able to spend, you know, days and weeks immersed in those games. And VR has that potential, right? And I completely agree that what we see in terms of the drawbacks of maybe a clunky hardware or a bad rendering is something that is completely overshadowed by the experience that these devices convey and how we remember those and internalize those experiences.
But it's probably not only about visual feedback or how it looks, but also about the other senses, how it feels, how it sounds. You mentioned that this is very important. Smell, I think there is work on how things could smell in VR, but I think that's super early.
There's two works I know of. One is Roshan's work on what happens if we cool down or heat up the headset itself and the kind of experience that we can create with that. And I think there was a Kai paper also where Pedro Lopez was involved this year about the heat as well as the kind of like the smell transmission and the immersion that comes from I think peppermint versus something more atrocious.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other projects that I work on uses the Ultraleap ultrasound boards, and so you have like a touchless haptic sensation, which is, I mean, right now what it can do is relatively limited. I mean, there's obviously no force feedback, but the kind of sensations paired with the visual actually can be quite powerful. So, and it's something that doesn't require any user instrumentation, so your hands are just free. So you can kind of feel things and paired with the visual stimulus, actually it's pretty compelling. So adding, there's a lot of really nice kind of haptic VR work using all sorts of, wearable stuff and using strange devices hooked onto controllers and all sorts of stuff. But I mean, for my part, I think that when you suddenly have your hands free, and certainly things like the Oculus SDK with hand tracking, which is coming, so you don't even have controllers anymore. It really frees up all sorts of kind of scenarios. Although we're still very like controller driven, but I think we're moving away from that. So you could have nice things like touchless haptics and heat and smell and all sorts.
Yep.
So earlier we talked about that this is on a continuum, and you said, well, the devices have to change before we can use them maybe in public or on a wider basis. What limits the use in spaces beyond my own home?
Yeah, well, so I'm doing this imagining based on a device having a pretty good form factor. So something that looks like just glasses or less. I mean, maybe it's even integrated into contacts or something. But the kind of scenario, which I think for me is what I'm trying to work towards. Let's say I'm sitting in a coffee shop and I'm working, and I'm working in a virtual like environment. So maybe I've got my virtual workspace around me, and I've got most of the coffee shop kind of out of my field of view. Maybe a little bit, maybe I'm keeping track of, the walkway that's around me, but my table and the wall and everything is all overlaid with fully virtual content. If you walk up to me in the coffee shop, what is the VR equivalent of me, half closing my laptop? If I was working on my laptop and you walked up, I maybe would half close it or fully close it to kind of show you, hey, okay, I'm paying attention, I've stopped working, I'm engaged in this conversation. Or on the flip side, I could sit there and lean into my laptop so I don't really feel like talking right now. If I'm working in a virtual environment, what is the digital equivalent of that? What would that look like, not only in my field of view, but in yours? How would you know that I have, removed some virtual content that would have been blocking you so I could see you? Those are the kind of design challenges, and that kind of fluid moving from more and more virtual content to more and more physical content. That's the space that I'm kind of trying to design for right now. So a lot of that is some technical things. I mean, obviously you need to have the environment tracked, you need to have all this ways of overlaying digital content, but a lot of it is also the social bit. How do I demonstrate to you that I have turned off some of this content that you can't see? That's one of the things when we think about even something as simple as the pass-through view on a VR headset, where I'm using the forward-facing cameras to see outside. How do you know if I'm seeing you or not? How do you know I'm not just watching a movie and I don't see anything versus I'm looking through the pass-through view and I can actually have a conversation with you? So there's so many open issues there, but I think those are the designs that we need to be kind of focusing on, so that this transitioning from, okay, I'm dialing down some of my virtual content so that I can talk to you, and then once you leave, then I'm kind of cranking in more of that virtual content so I can go back to my virtual workspace. That's the scenario I want to get to.
So it's probably not only the person in VR, but it's also the person outside of the VR, right? So how do I interrupt you? How do I approach you if I don't know what you're actually doing? So I don't know your situation. I don't know if you're fully immersed or not. And in the physical world, I probably see that. Because I also get all the feedback from you. But in the virtual world, if you are there, but I'm not, then how do I interrupt you even?
Exactly. Yeah. So these are all the kind of the open challenges. I mean, one of the things that I'm quite interested when I'm thinking about co-located VR experiences is actually using that physical proximity as the kind of first, way of bringing you in. So because we already would have those kind of existing social boundaries. So, with you guys, I'd be very comfortable to walk up to you, be within arm's distance, or even kind of reach out and, touch you to interrupt you, because we have that kind of existing relationship. So that could govern how this works. As where if it's a stranger, I'm probably not going to even go within an arm's reach of them. If I'm walking through the coffee shop, I'm not going to like brush my hand along their table as I walk past. But, if I saw you guys, I'd probably do something like that, right? So it's kind of trying to make use of already these existing social practices that we have and turning those into kind of something meaningful as far as input. Because actually physical proximity, you guys have done proxemic interactions with displays and things as well. It's a really powerful thing. And if I'm willing to get close enough to you that actually I could reach out and touch you or kind of be in kind of physical contact with you, then we probably already have an existing relationship. So could we use that, for example, to control something around the visibility or privacy? It could be a type of virtual handshake if I'm that close enough to you, because I wouldn't allow you to be that close to me if I don't know who you are, right? So there's a lot of open challenges there, and I think it's exciting.
Oh, it's probably about attention, maybe. So you look at someone, and that someone typically realizes that you look at them. So if you're in a coffee shop and you stare at someone, then they will notice. And if I know you and I come and I look at you, then you notice that as well. So maybe that's something we should also consider when we design these experiences. So if someone from the physical world looks at me, then this is kind of transferred to my VR experience. And then I realize that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would love to be in a future where, we're always, 24 hours a day, 6 degrees of freedom and kind of gaze tracked, right? Because then you could do some really nice things around that, where if I, look at you in the coffee shop, this begins some kind of digital handshake between us, so that we could then, maybe step out of the virtual environment or do something else together. And I mean, right now it's a shame because most of the form factors we have occlude the face, which is so important for this kind of social handshake that we would do with looking at each other and making eye contact. And eye contact is obviously super important. So we'll get there though.
It's also interesting to think about how we can fuse these different things. So sometimes I have 2 Zoom meetings at the same time, and then I can obviously only attend to one. But then the other one would like to raise my attention. In a physical world, I could imagine I'm sitting in my office, I have a meeting with some people, and then other people come in. Or even if I'm in a more open place, then I could talk with some people, and then other people could interrupt me. And this would be all physical, but then transferring that to a virtual world, there could be different parties and they could interrupt me or not. And I think the other people, if you have multiple people in VR experience, they would kind of have to notice what is going on with me and what's going on with my attention to these different things that might interrupt me or catch my attention.
Yeah. I mean, and the kind of 2 platforms that we have for doing these types of things. So think about the difference between like Zoom and Hubs. I mean, we actually have a greatly reduced kind of window of attention. So if you're in Zoom, we have this kind of small thing here. And so it would be really hard. You're focusing on a 2D plane, right? I mean, it's really hard to try to multitask in any meaningful way. But likewise in Hubs, then we have a similar issue where actually your physical field of view is smaller, right? So it's not like I have my peripheral vision and I can see someone waving at me. So we're still not really fully utilizing the kind of peripheral vision that we have, where if I was in my office, I could easily kind of attend to someone, in the meeting room down the hall if they wanted to grab me for a moment. So we're definitely not utilizing our capabilities with these devices, and yet we're still exhausting ourselves doing it, right? So there's a lot of work to be done.
It seems to me a lot of it is figuring it out as these technologies are deployed. And I found it fascinating how, a so-called Zoom etiquette evolved in the last 2 months, right? So in the beginning, where everyone has been on Skype or Google Hangouts or something like that in the past, but we never really gave it too much thought about, how do we make ourselves heard, or what if, there's more than 10 or more than 100 people in the room. And so I think a lot of these, social cues that are missing in that interaction, and then that cause people to fall over each other, especially in an open discussion round, were kind of naturally solved, or not completely, but at least I think we saw an evolution of people adjusting their behavior based on what they experienced in their Zoom meetings, such as an outgoing Roomba, or a cat or a child jumps to the image, was much more common in the very beginning of this. Or that people like crash a meeting with the blaring sounds on. Now everyone's kind of like silently enters the meeting with the mute on. And this is a very different behavior from what we would do in a coffee shop, right? I mean, I don't mute myself necessarily if I go in a coffee shop and when I walk in and have a conversation with the person I'm walking in. So that's really interesting to see whether, do you think a replication of what we think works in the real world when it comes to social signals, or might VR also provide a whole new platform for developing new kinds of signals and interaction ways of interactions for us?
Yeah. I mean, Zoom is interesting because obviously it's mediating this interaction. This is kind of working nicely. But I think even, for example, over the course of the last hour, socially, we've actually kind of warmed up into this conversation, right? You think about the first 5 minutes, and I think it's a little bit stilted. Even this morning, even though I've known you guys both for a very long time, and so I think we still need that kind of space to warm up, build a rapport. And, even though I think probably all of us have been sitting on Zoom calls nonstop for the last 2 or 3 months, right? So maybe we're not doing some of the really annoying things. Like if I hear one more person come into a Zoom call and spend a minute saying, "Oh my God, I'm sorry, I was muted, blah, blah, blah," instead of just saying what they were going to say, I think I'm going to throw my laptop out the window. So like we've developed some norms, right? And we've kind of got that part. But we still actually, even as like Zoom, power users or whatever, we still, the three of us, needed to, warm up and kind of get settled into this conversation. So those kind of social issues, I think, no matter how good the platform is, you're still going to need that time to kind of get into a flow. And maybe we could make that easier, right? But certainly it's still kind of part of getting things done and having a nice kind of conversation.
And I think it's also all about like how when I look at your face, I see all this movement, I see that you're attending the meeting and all these things, and all this facial expression I see where you look at. And I think that's at the moment still so much better than VR experiences, because we're not there to really track the eye movement, track how the face looks and facial gestures and things like that. But I think that might be a huge step forward if you have that in VR. I mean, there are devices that can do that, and there are tons of research that are doing that, right? But I think that is something that's so helpful for these Zoom meetings compared it to just an audio conference. I think that's much more difficult, because then I don't know when you want to start saying something if you don't have video. Or I'm not sure what you're actually doing in your room. And I think that's very helpful for Zoom or video conferences in general, and something we are still missing in VR at the moment. But I think that will come in the near future.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's kind of benefits and detriments to both. I mean, and this type of conversation where we're going to have a kind of longer kind of, beginning, middle, end type of meeting, I think this works really well, and we can, see each other, and there's quite a lot of information coming out of the video. But something which is more like, thinking back to virtual conferences, the kind of hallway conversations, where there's not necessarily there's no set time. It's not a discrete activity. It's, it's something more continuous. That is something actually where you get quite a lot from the other information that would be in the virtual environment. So in that case, so in this conversation, I'm not going to kind of sit here and start staring out the window and not paying attention, right? I mean, this is like a focused interaction. But in a VR meetup, that would be something that's maybe more appropriate. If I'm like getting ready to leave this group and join a different group, I might slowly kind of angle my body in a different position. I might slowly step back. So that information becomes much more useful in that type of context. Like one of the kind of groups I've started going to, so Hubs, Mozilla Hubs has a regular meetup for developers, and they post it in Hubs. And that's actually really interesting, because you do see different groups kind of branching off, and people are moving between the groups. And that's something that you couldn't really do in Zoom, because it's this more kind of continuous, unfocused, breaking out groups doing stuff. And so in Hubs, that works really well. But if we were trying to have this conversation in Hubs, it would probably be just awkward and really hard, and also VR would not probably add anything in that context. So yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of information that comes from the spatial kind of movement in a virtual environment, but it's not always, that information is not always rich, depending on what type of interaction you're hosting.
What's the future of AR? Do you think these devices will become mobile enough and unobtrusive enough that we can take them anywhere? That I can dive or switch between the real world and the virtual world anytime I so choose? Or do you think it will more go into a cave scenario where we have dedicated little VR spaces in our home in which we then immerse ourselves at night or during the day, depending?
Yeah, well, I would certainly like to see the former. And that's, I'm putting all my eggs in that basket of this kind of always on wearable immersive devices. I mean, I think having kind of purpose-built spaces for people alone in their homes in VR is a kind of dystopian vision. And so all of the work that I've been doing, I'm kind of trying to move towards this idea of VR out in the world, of always on devices. And it's not there yet, but like the frames, they are actually, and I use them pretty regularly in my daily life. I think I got, yeah. So you can see, this is what they look like. They're a little bit dorky, but I think I can pull off a heavy frame. But they look like this. They're pretty normal. You can put your prescription in them if you like. But the kind of best example of using this is I was visiting York actually a couple months ago, and we were walking around going to this place for dinner, and we were all, we didn't know where we were going. We were meeting York there, and so I had the Google walking directions in my frames, and I was leading the group, and I said, "Oh, I think we're almost there." "Oh, she didn't say it was up on the left." And nobody knew exactly what I was talking about, and everybody just thought I knew where I was. And what I meant was the Google Assistant usually tells you when you've arrived, and she didn't tell me this. And so I told the project manager, Alice, I was like, "Oh, I was listening to the walking directions. I don't know this city." And so it was this idea that, actually it was so seamless. Nobody realized, A, that I was using this walking direction, and I looked really competent. I looked like I knew where I was going, and it had completely augmented my capability. And that's just the most simple thing of like private audio piped into my ear in a device that no one realized I was wearing. And so I think like that's the first step. And I think we'll get more and more along that kind of spectrum until we're at a place where people have these always on immersive devices and it's kind of just part of life. So I can't wait until we have more than just, the audio channel. But I think this is one of the first devices that's really compelling to me, because you do have, as I say, 3 degrees of freedom tracking, private audio. The quality is quite good. Something as simple as looking competent in a city where you don't live, I think that's actually quite a lot to be achieved. And certainly I think all all of us have probably done something from one time or another of kind of navigation and multimodal cues and whatever, right? But the walking directions privately piped into your ear, so simple, works so well, and yeah, makes you look really competent. So I think, yeah, immersive devices are going to invade into our everyday lives, and it's already here, but I want more channels, more fidelity, and that's where I think it's going.
What do you think are other important research directions that people look into at the moment?
I think across the board, input techniques have not kind of kept up with the visual progress. So I don't know if you saw the release of the new Unreal engine. It is really unreal. I would definitely watch it if you have a chance. But so we have these like graphics that can be rendered in real time and are better than like 4K, which is crazy. And then we're still doing these like gestures in midair and like pinch and zoom, and like it's not kept up. And I personally, having done gesture-based research for most of my career, I mean, I think these type of midair gestures are just never going to bridge the gap, right? So there's a lot of interesting work on input techniques in VR, and I think that just needs to like accelerate to match the kind of audio, the output techniques, the audio, the visual, because if we have these high fidelity visual environments that look better than like what I can visually see, and then I'm sitting there like pinching to zoom, I mean, it completely breaks down, right? So that's one of the areas which I think is super, super important. And then of course the hardware form factors. I mean, I'm not focusing myself in my life and career in engineering or product design, but those are the other bits that you need so that something like, you know, an Oculus Quest, which is like, can turn into something like a frame, you know? So that's more of a thing that just needs time and investment, but input techniques is something the research community could certainly be pushing.
We did some work on like text entry in VR using keyboards, and then you can type, and there's surprising amounts of work in this direction that replicates current input techniques that we have for actual computers in VR. I was thinking about VR and the real world. I mean, I don't have input techniques that I use at this very moment, right? I control this meeting via my computer, but then the meeting is running and I don't use any input techniques. Why do I use that in VR? Why do I even need that in VR? If I can track myself, so I have full body motion capture, I think that's obviously super useful. But then do I really need to control the computer for most situations?
Yeah, well, in some situations, I think it would be useful. So it again goes back to this idea in a virtual environment, you're not constrained by the physical. So when I'm here working in my home office, I have, you know, this amount of space and most of the stuff is kind of arranged so that it's within my arm's distance. But if I'm in a virtual environment, I mean, it's absolutely no cost to me to move. So if I want to go and do something in my home, I have to get up, but my chair's kind of squished in this corner, so I have to like get out of this little corner. It's actually like a high cost to do something that's not within my arm's reach. As we're in the virtual environment, you know, I might want to move to a different space. I might want to, I can control much more about the environment. So I think there's much more possibility for input. And so, yeah, maybe once I have things up and running, I'm not going to want to do much, but I might want to move to different areas. I might want to, you know, have these windows to look out of the virtual environment, or I might want to mix how much reality I'm bringing into the virtual environment. So there's just much more stuff that I might want to do, which is why I think the input techniques become more important, because there's still these kind of quite clunky, you know, discrete actions. I mean, that's been a challenge, I think, in input techniques forever, is kind of turning clunky, discrete things into more continuous, nice feeling things. But in the virtual environment, there just becomes so much more that we could control, and yet we're still using these clunky techniques.
You mentioned the arm's reach and the kind of like the context of your workspace, right? And one thing that I see where VR really comes in really handy is a complete context switch, right? So can I, if I could manipulate my work environment even to reflect the specific task I'm doing right now, that could help me be more efficient, right? And so you mentioned, for example, you sit in a cafe and you kind of like you arrange the space to so that there's virtual content on the wall, right? And so the entire walls could change with the tasks. And where now, if we do, for example, I don't know, a brainstorming or a thematic analysis, and everything goes up on the wall, right? It usually hangs there for a couple days, weeks, maybe even a month, right? Until the next study comes along, right? But what if you could switch, or what if you could manipulate different aspects, like not just the lighting, but also maybe the smell, to really support the learning task, for example, that we're involved in. And we heard from the beginning, for example, that when you mentioned that this notion of multimodality and the immersion really manipulates our perception and our memory formation, right? And it's a really powerful tool. And so if we could use that to support our learning process or to support our productivity in the workspace and change on the fly to support the exact task we're doing, that would be super cool. And then also, I guess one of the questions, and I was thinking when you talked about this notion of having anytime access to your VR surroundings. What if that actually gets compromised? What if you have a malicious actor kind of like keeping you from work, or worse, right, trying to direct you or even traumatize you? So that, I don't know if you come across any of that work or any of the thoughts that you have when you're sitting in your dark corner and ponder over world domination. But what could be the more devastating outcomes, I wonder?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about things like context switching and task switching and devastating outcomes, actually, because it's one of the things. I'm a big fan of the book Deep Work. And, they're talking about like the fragmentation of your work day, and that this actually knowledge workers become less and less and less and less and less productive, which is kind of scary, right? We're tired and we feel busy, but we achieve very little, which is a bit traumatizing. So I'm thinking about the kind of specific context switch, for example, of being at my desk versus being in my VR lab. And in the real world, this is something that has physical and time cost. And the lab is across from my office, so it's not even like I have to go really anywhere. But I've got to close up my office and walk 10 steps and go into the VR lab. So when I'm going there, I'm doing quite focused work because of this kind of cost of the context switch. And I wonder, there would certainly be something gained by being able to instantly switch into different spaces. Like one of my big frustrations, I regularly work on kind of 3 or 4 different machines, because like my VR development machine, I've got my laptop that I use, I've got my desktop machine at work. It's like I've got different contexts that I'm switching through, and it's a frustration that none of these environments are really synced up in any meaningful way. I've got Dropbox, and that's like the best, really. And between, and so it's like context switching is costly in a negative way when I'm thinking about my development environments, but it's costly in a nice way when I talk about the physically walking to a different space. And so thinking about if this was all virtual and I could switch instantly, would my work become better, or would I become so fragmented that I couldn't achieve much? And yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about in the kind of ethics of VR, with these kind of malicious characters, right? And you can imagine the typical, capitalist ones that, lead me to buy and consume, and it's really put into my psyche that I need these things, or that they'll make me happy, or whatever. But you could also imagine these types of actors infiltrating your virtual environment to make you things that we're already seeing when we think about social media bubbles, to make me believe the world is a certain way. And then that results in my behavior being something that's maybe negative towards society, right? So there's so many different ways that VR could become this evil thing. And I guess I just hope with some of the work that we're doing. I mean, I don't focus specifically on ethics, but I do kind of try to incorporate that in. And I'm just, I want to find these positive visions of VR, these useful scenarios, And as we move towards this future that I think is this always on immersive devices, where is that gonna take us? And is that going to be something led by research, or is that going to be something led by corporate interest or kind of hardware development, which I think would be less positive. So I hope that VR can be a positive impact on people's lives, both for entertainment and socializing and productivity. But I don't think that would happen without some intervention from the research community.
I think a lot of people can sympathize with this notion of, if you don't have a context switch, you just being zoomed out. This is exactly what we are experiencing right now, where everything happens in these 4 square meters. And so, but on the bright side, we can have people from Glasgow, people from Regensburg, and people from Melbourne all join together and have a conversation. And yeah, there's ups and downs and goods and bads and uglies. And well, let's focus on the goods. And thank you for making it all the way down to Australia.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.